So just to sum up about these different interactions, the evocative interaction is where children invoke different responses in different people by virtue of inherited traits such as attractiveness. Attractive people maybe are used to people deferring to them and being deferential towards them, so they grow up in a world of deference, so they become less tolerant of situations where they've got to be patient and where people maybe are treating them a little bit, as they see it, unfairly. So these are important things to bear in mind. What about the environment? Because the environment is a complicated thing, and there are many different aspects to the environment. Here's a simple question. Who is the most similar, do you think? Identical twins reared in the same household, or identical twins reared in different households? Quick pause there for thought. In fact, there seems to be no difference at all. Identical twins reared together are no more similar to each other than those reared apart. There's very little difference between them. So the environment of growing up in the same parental household seems not to be having any real effect. Remember, I trumpeted the advantages of identical twins reared apart versus together because of the possible effect that this growing up in the same household might have at making the kids more similar. But it turns out, it seems to be the case, it doesn't really matter. So together or apart, they tend to be just as similar, irrespective of which environment that they grew up in. Adopted siblings, in another study, are no more similar to each other than random members of the population. What does that mean? It means two individuals, mum and dad, not mum and dad, a man and a woman meet, and then they decide to adopt some kids. So they adopt one kid who's born of one parent and another kid who's born of another set of parents. Essentially what we have there is a family whereby nobody's related to each other. You would hope, obviously, that mum and dad aren't related to each other. Then mum and dad aren't related to either of the offspring because they're not their children. And the offspring are born of different parents, so they're not related to each other either. Again, you might have thought that growing up in the same environment, in the same household, the same parents, would tend to make those kids more similar to each other. But again, on measures such as personality, intelligence, values, things like that, they're no more similar to each other than any two members of the population picked up at random, measured at random. And this is called the shared environment. The shared environment is the environment that each twin or each individual shares with the other one. So the fact that both went to church with parents, that they used to go on holidays abroad, the fact that they watched a certain amount of television, the fact that whatever experiences they have with their parents don't seem to make these people any more similar to each other. And again, that's Eric Turkheimer's work. So which part of the environment matters? Well, what seems to matter in making people more or less similar to each other is a so-called the unique experiences or the unique environment. So, for example, twins can be different because one twin gets sick, the other one doesn't. One twin ingests toxin, the other doesn't. One twin has a more stressful life than the other. One twin has a less healthy, all those things. Or it could just be random chance. There are many billions of synapses in the brain. There's many billions of cells in the human body. There's 25,000 genes. There's simply not enough information in those genes to specify the position of every last cell of the synapse. Okay, so although the structure of the kidneys, the structure of the heart, the structure of the brain, the structure of the eye, the structure of the teeth, mouth, leg, whatever, is to some extent determined by genes, and differences in those things can be affected by differences in genes, as we saw, whether you have six fingers, extra digits, whether you have fused fingers, missing joints, can be affected by different genes. But there's simply not enough genes to specify everything. So there will be random variations and differences. So if you look at the structure of the kidneys of two identical twins, they will be very similar, but they won't be identical. Genetic identical doesn't equal phenotypic similarity, being identical. So chance seems to play a role in shaping the brain as well, because the genes, if you like, guide a developmental trajectory, but they don't completely determine it. They set it in process, but there's other things going on which could affect development. And if you consider the uterine environment, quite often identical twins will share the same placenta, because remember, these are individuals. Well, it's one individual and they become two individuals. So sometimes they will share a placenta, and one twin may monopolise the placenta just for some random reason, so is able to get more nutrients than the other twin, which can lead to differences. As the fetus is developing, maybe a cosmic ray comes flying through the mother's uterus, which sounds fantasy, but it isn't, and changes a particular cell in a particular way, which then multiplies and changes the structure of the whole individual as it develops. Loads of differences that could happen. Mother ingests a toxin, but because one kid's got more share of the placenta, they get more of the toxin. So a lot of randomness could be leading to these effects rather than being more purposeful parts of the environment. Okay, so let's just think of some important lessons here. As a kind of a summary. Most, maybe all, traits, illnesses have some degree of heritability, whether that's schizophrenia, heart disease, whatever. People might be predisposed to develop or not develop a disorder. So, not say predisposed to develop, some people have, if you like, a predisposition to resist certain diseases or not to develop certain things. So, resistance to tooth decay, for example, is something which is genetic. We've already seen sickle cell anemia, where people have a certain resistance to a disease, malaria, when they have one copy of the sickle cell gene. That's heterozygous advantage. Few diseases are genetically deterministic. Few genes have one single gene or even multiple genes which cause the gene deterministically, and with the environment having no effect. Sickle cell anemia is one, Huntington's disease is another, possibly cystic fibrosis is the third. Most of them seem to require an environmental contribution. One of them is PKU. I'll briefly mention PKU. PKU is a disorder, and the acronym stands for phenylketonuria. And phenylketonuria is a genetic disorder which is caused by a particular genetic mutation, which means the individual is unable to process an amino acid. Doesn't matter what it is, but it's called phenylalanine, if you care to know. Phenylalanine is an amino acid which is relatively common, but not in everything. It's not in every food. So if you have a diet which is free from phenylalanine, you will not get the disease. You will have the gene for it, but in the absence of the food, you will not suffer the disease, because what happens is if you ingest the disease, it builds up and causes brain damage, leading to learning disabilities. So what you need to do, there's no cure, but the solution is to avoid a diet which contains phenylalanine. And if you do that, you will not develop the disease. And if you look at anything which contains artificial sweeteners, such as fizzy drinks and so on, if it's a diet drink particularly, it will have to say on it, contains a source of phenylalanine. This is to warn people who have PKU to avoid that drink. So we've got a gene-environment interaction. We have a predisposition to develop PKU, but unless we have the correct environment, we will not develop it. And most things, most diseases, chronic heart disease, cancers it seems, many of the mental illnesses, diabetes probably, seems to be a disorder. We need a combination of gene plus environment. And if we don't have one of those, then we're absolutely fine. But we need that combination. Heritability estimates, second point, heritability estimates vary in terms of sample used. So we've seen, very important there, that within group differences may be entirely genetic, but between group differences may be massive. So make sure you think about this when you're thinking about these kind of studies, because it's important to bear in mind that it's easy for people to pull the wool over your eyes by quoting some statistic showing you that there's no point in health promotion or health interventions because something is entirely genetic. Well, actually, if you look at different sample, might be very different. And we've seen also that the environment can have a bigger effect in poor environments than it does in rich environments where genes seem to be the most important thing. And given that most of the twins that tend to be studied tend to be from relatively well-off environments because they're the ones that tend to volunteer for the research, maybe this is a bit of a missing, a bit of a blind spot in our data. Okay. So a super important political point. So always think of Lewontin's patterns. Okay, I think that really helps when you're thinking critically about these things. Most diseases with a genetic predisposition are polygenic. In other words, it's not one gene causing the disorder; it's a multiple combination of genes. Genes which may in one environment, in other words, genes which, when in partnership with one set of genes, may produce a really healthy individual, may, when in partnership with other genes, produce a less healthy individual. So it's important to look at the genetic environment as well. Most genes also are pleiotropic. Oh, cancers, hypertension, diabetes, things like that are examples of that. Many genes are pleiotropic. They have many effects. So if we're going to start replacing genes, this could possibly be problematic because as well as curing the obvious disorder, it might have knock-on effects elsewhere, basically like the side effects of a drug. There are many moral issues concerning genetic testing. Would you want to know, for example, if little can be done to help you? So, for example, if Huntington's disease, it might be good to know if they can help you, but with Huntington's disease, we don't necessarily can't do much about it. On the other hand, is it fair to know and pass the genome by having children? This is analogous to the ethics of inoculation. The reason why we take inoculations is not just to help ourselves, but also to help other people. Because if we become an immunity to a particular disease, then it's less likely that we'll pass that on to somebody else. And this is how epidemics are avoided. Once a certain number of people have become inoculated, then diseases don't usually reach epidemic proportions because there's simply not enough uninoculated people for the disease to jump from person to person to person to person and cause an epidemic. Once, I can't remember the actual figure, but once a certain percent, we drop below a certain percentage, then we can get an epidemic. So the ethics of inoculation aren't just about individual decisions to protect ourselves, it's about protecting other people that we might infect. Okay, that's behavioural genetics. Hopefully we can talk about this more in a workshop. Any questions, please write them down and we'll talk about it. Thank you.